Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking the rise of protectionism, economic nationalism, and what that means for the commodities sector. Over the last few years, and accelerated by the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the energy transition, protectionist policies around the world are proliferating, as is government intervention in trade. A stark reverse from the policies of the 90s and noughties, which led to unprecedented global wealth and opportunity. What does this mean for global commodities trade? What does it mean for the energy transition? What does it mean for the companies involved? What does it mean for us as individuals? To discuss protectionism is our guest, Alex Tuckett, Head of Economics at CRU, the independent commodities research firm. Previously, Alex was with the Bank of England and the UK Treasury. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on. We're always interested in guest ideas or connections for guests, so please do contact me if you have those. That'd be much appreciated. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Paul. Great to be here.
We're talking the rise of protectionism and what that means for the commodities world and part of sort of this ongoing deglobalization thread that is affecting every participant and us all as individuals. Can you just set the scene for us? What do we mean by protectionism? And just give us some context of that before we talk a bit about the history and how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, certainly. So in short, what we mean by protectionism is restrictions on trade from policy. So things that politicians do that make trade either more difficult or more expensive or both. And when you say protectionism, a lot of people think about at the border interventions, what we call at the border. So things like tariffs and quotas, and certainly they're very important. But what also matters and what can also be encompassed by the term, I think, is what are called behind the border measures. So these are things like distortive subsidies, which tilt the playing field in favour of domestic products, rules for preferential government procurement that favour domestically produced things. Even product standards can be a form of trade distortion. So, for example, in the EU, if you want to buy something called champagne, it has to write champagne on the label, has to be from the region, the Champagne region in France. Now, the EU would argue, well, that's protecting consumers, letting them know what they're really buying. But a lot of producers in the US and even perhaps some in southern England might argue, well, it's putting up barriers to the market. And the last thing I'll say, I guess, is that it's not just about trade. It can cover investment flows as well. So foreign ownership of companies, for instance, the big arguments at the moment about US steel, and it can also be outgoing, controlling exports or technology or investment leaving the country. So in a sense, I think economic nationalism might be a better and broader term than just protectionism.
In the long sweep of history, there's sort of been a pendulum that swung between protectionism or economic nationalism and free trade. You've got the Whigs in the 18th century, and sort of that whole piece. You have a period of economic nationalism in the Gilded Age and so forth from a US perspective, and that really runs all the way up through the 70s, and then there's even to the 80s, and then there's this sort of explosion of free trade thinking. I guess, you're the economist, not me. Can you give us some sense of the history of this? And in particular, the last, the 90s and the 2000s and into the 2010s was a long period of ever more free trade. And, one can look at the extraordinary growth in GDPs around the world and people brought out of poverty to show some of the results of that. Can you bring us up to that point, and then we'll talk about why things started turning?
Yeah, certainly. So I won't go back to the 17 or 1800s, but in the 90s and noughties, we saw a period of deepening globalization. We saw world trade and flows in FDI grow quite quickly and grow faster than world GDP. And That was driven by a few things. I think first in the early 90s by the collapse of the Soviet bloc, which brought a lot of Eastern Europe into great integration with the world economy. And then even more importantly, then China and then Southeast Asia integrating into that world, a liberal attitude to trade and liberalization of trade rules under the WTO. And there was a political consensus in the West at the time that saw trade as a relatively positive thing, as a tool both for development, for less developed countries to help them pull themselves out of poverty, but also as a way of providing prosperity and cheaper access to goods in the West. And during that time, you saw the development of very complex cross-country and cross-continent, in many cases, supply chains, particularly primarily in manufacturing, but even in services to some extent.
Because all of this story sort of threads together in this, with the energy transition, and obviously commodities have always been at the very center of global trade. We have this rise of sort of economic nationalism, obviously, very much where I'm sat in the US, driven by the Trump administration and the language, that they were using at the time around NAFTA and, the Pacific agreements and so forth. But this has been sort of a global backlash that's been going on really since the global financial crisis. Can you just help us understand kind of why sort of the pendulum has swung back towards economic nationalism and how it has manifested itself more broadly before we talk about commodity specific stuff?
Yeah, certainly. So since then, I'll say in the last of 5, 6, 7 years, we've definitely seen a movement in the other direction. And we've seen the number of trade restrictions, which was 200-300 a year shortly after the GFC. That went up to about 900 in 2018, and it was about 2,000 last year. And the number of trade agreements, which liberalize trade or remove those restrictions, has gone in the other direction. So quantitatively, you can really see that change in global policy and approach. Why has that happened? I think there are a number of reasons. I think a lot of people would point to populism as a political movement, and would argue that populism was at least partly, if not mainly, a backlash against those sort of free trade policies of the 90s and noughties. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that's true. I think the reasons for populism are quite complex. We won't go into them here because that would be a whole another podcast. But whether it's true or not, whether you buy that thesis of free trade has led to populism, the fear of populism in mainstream parties and the desire to sort of outflank populists has led to a more protectionist approach for sure. I think another factor is COVID, and that saw a massive increase in the role of the state and increased acceptance in the role of the state in the economy to try to direct the economy, and that's changed the political weather a bit. Although this trend was in place before COVID, I would say. I think the biggest reasons though have to do with China and how its economy has matured and its role in the global economy has matured. Most obviously for the US, there's strategic rivalry with China. I think under the Obama administration, there was this idea that if the West traded more with China, if it engaged more with it, China would just open up, not just economically, but culturally and become more democratic. That's simply not been borne out. Under Xi, China has become more and more autocratic and not really friendlier to the West. So there's been a backlash against that, and there's now very much a consensus in American politics. One of the few consensuses there is that China is a big rival, if not threat. Also, I think more subtly, the role of China and the effect of China on the rest of the world has changed. So initially in the noughties, where China was integrating the world economy, seeing very rapid growth in its exports and its GDP, that was obviously providing a lot of competition and putting firms out of business in many industries. But there's also a deflationary impulse in goods markets. It meant goods inflation, was negative for a lot of the time in the West. And that boosted consumer real incomes. It also allowed central banks in the West to run the economy a bit hotter and to have a bit more service inflation stronger, tighter labour markets than you otherwise would have. So there were some benefits too. From the GFC onwards, I think China's role shifted a bit. By then, it was a bigger share of world GDP, and it became more important on the demand side, particularly with the collapse in demand in the West. China saw huge fiscal stimulus packages pushing a lot of infrastructure, a lot of housing investment, and that sucked in huge amounts, particularly of commodities. But generally, it boosted demand in the world, and that obviously had both winners and losers. But it certainly had a lot of winners clearly in commodity exporting countries like Australia and Brazil and Indonesia and many others. Now, if you look what China is doing at the moment, the position it's in, that cost differential has closed a lot. Chinese wages are still well below in the West, but that gap is much smaller than it was, and China's not creating the same kind of deflation in goods markets. And at the same time, it's moved up. There are some exceptions, I should say, which I'll come on to in clean tech, where China's having a very deflationary effect. But also, China's moved up the value chain, so it's not just clothes and children's toys and things. It's moving into higher value-added industries like autos, where it exported almost nothing 5 years ago, and now it's the biggest auto exporter in the world. Into capital goods, and that's particularly threatening, I think, particularly for Europe, where a country like Germany, which largely benefited from China's integration in the world economy previously, is now feeling competed with. And then the other thing is domestic demand in China is now very weak for various reasons, partly to do with demographics, partly to do with past overinvestment, and also the stifling of the private sector. Anyway, that means China has a very big overcapacity in certain sectors, steel as an example, and it's exporting a lot of cheap materials, a lot of cheap products. That's leading to some quite painful competition and pressure on governments to do things to protect their domestic industries. There's a number of anti-dumping investigations in steel at the moment from various places. So I think there's a variety of reasons why the world has turned against free trade.
I mean, it is a complex picture, right? There's no necessarily one right answer. I think a variety of economists would argue that free trade, the classic Economist article that it allows the best placed country to produce things at the lowest cost, all that good stuff. But obviously, there is populism. There is that narrative about protectionism that appeals to people at a local level when you're losing your factory to Mexico, wherever it might be. But there's also, the world is entering, essentially, you could argue, an entirely new industrial age, the age of clean technology. And just like in the previous industrial age, those people who had oil or the capability to refine it had an absolute advantage. In this new age, those people who dominate the supply chains for clean technologies are going to dominate it. So there is this argument of obviously wanting to put in protectionism so that you can protect your nascent industry, where rather than being flooded by, for example, $10,000 EVs that would just kill off any domestic capability to produce them. That's not necessarily in the interest of consumers, right? I mean, in the end, people would like a perfectly good $10,000 electric car or car in general, right? It's not good for the consumer, but it actually makes sense for the country. I know that's quite a garbled and will make economists around the world collapse, but so there is this sort of sense, and it's one that's sharpened by geopolitical competition, particularly again in this restructuring of the global energy map as we have it. We put together a couple of examples to show how impactful this is and how it works through, and then we're going to move on to talk about the broader challenges for the commodities sector being front and center to this and what it means for them, given that most of them have arisen in a world of that 90s and noughties, which were of a free global trade and huge opportunities for those companies that could span it. Let's start with, I guess, that clean tech world which we've been talking about. Can you give us some examples of how trade intervention is ongoing and what the impacts are and why?
Yeah, certainly. So clean tech or green tech is definitely an area that's just getting caught up in this move towards protectionism. So some analysis we've done here at Crew shows that an increasing share of trade interventions are affecting green technology. And remember, of course, that the number of trade restrictions in absolute has gone up very, very significantly. And then the share that affect green tech has roughly doubled since 2009 to about 1 in 6. Partly those restrictions are in the form of tariffs. So, for example, the US has had punitive tariffs in place against Chinese solar panels and components for more than 10 years. What in practice that means is most of the imported solar panels coming into the US have come from Southeast up the value chain, still embedded in them. More recently, the US has put tariffs on Chinese EVs and EV batteries, and in a bit of a change of policy direction, a bit of a departure, the EU has also put tariffs on Chinese EVs. And it's not just at the border, it's behind the border too. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US gives very generous subsidies for investment in renewables, in EVs, in green hydrogen. But to get that money, you need to effectively buy American, or at least from countries very friendly to America, and there's specific rules that try to push out Chinese companies from the value chain. What's driving this? I'll say a bit about why first, and then why this matters. This particular type of protectionism sort of matters for the world. What's driving it? I think, as you said, Paul, clean technology is becoming more and more important as we go through this huge energy transition. And it's growing very rapidly. It's accounting now for a larger share of industrial production and trade worldwide. So it's around 6% of world trade. Now, that's still relatively small. It's sort of much higher than it was 10 years ago. But that could grow exponentially given the kind of investment we'll need to make for the energy transition. The IEA estimate something like $36 trillion of additional investment in the energy system will be needed out to 2050 if we're going to reach net zero. That's on top of what we're sort of currently doing anyway. And what that means basically is that governments are increasingly seeing green technology sectors as being strategically important, not just as a solution to climate change, but even if they don't necessarily believe in climate change, as a source of future growth and well-paid industrial jobs, politically, obviously very important. Now, China essentially recognized these sectors were strategically important 10 to 15 years ago and put huge amounts of state support into them, and is now, the result, has a very low cost base in many of these technologies. To some extent, we're seeing the rest of the world trying to sort of catch up with that, in some cases too late. Now, why does this matter? And again, I think, Paul, you sort of really touched on this, is you've got this trade-off between, on the one hand, promoting or protecting domestic sectors, which is a very, laudable aim, but also the cost that is being passed on to end users, to consumers, to investors who are installing these solar panels, who are driving these EVs. And to the extent these trade restrictions raise those costs, which they do, certainly in the US, you see that in solar, for example. Solar panels much more expensive in the US relative to other countries. That it increases the cost of the energy transition for taxpayers or consumers or both, and for investors. And put simply, the world could decarbonize a lot faster and more cheaply without those trade restrictions if it is willing to import the technology it needs from wherever that's cheapest, which in many cases is China.
Yeah. I mean, it's challenging, isn't it? Because, all politics is local. So there are very few voices out there at the moment, it feels, who are arguing for the global free trade order that we have been in. And it seems to me that, and I'm probably right in saying here, that this wouldn't be a problem if China weren't seen as a geopolitical rival, as opposed to just a growing economy, right? There is sort of a backdrop of tension here, that it's this sort of, this alliance of China, Russia, Iran, and so forth against sort of the global West. And I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but, that's the key driver here, rather than necessarily purely the economic arguments. And again, it's hard for any local politician to tackle that, right? There doesn't seem to be many champions of this sort of retrograde, arguably, step, which is ultimately going to pass on cost to all these consumers, right? I mean, all of us are going to pay more for the energy transition. And I think your recent work has highlighted as well, that, and I guess we'll come on to it, that this will be a slowdown in the global economy if all these trends persist.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, as you say, that geopolitical element is really important, and it really adds an edge to it. I think if you take the parallel of Japan in the 80s, where there are many similar fears that Japan was eating America's lunch, it was taking over, it was competing, it was destroying the US car industry, and so on. But ultimately, Japan was not a geopolitical rival to the US, and they found ways to work through it and still have an economic relationship. That partly meant, for example, Japanese car manufacturers building loads of factories in North America to supply their demand there. Now that's happening to some extent with China and Europe, but really not at all with the US. So that geopolitical side of it is very important.
Yeah. The second example, which is obviously close to the heart of this podcast, given we had Chip Miller on talking about his book, Chip Wall, is semiconductors. And this is just another prime example where, you've got a huge amount of intervention ongoing, which is introducing a lot of complexity to the system and challenges at the company level and at the country level. Can you just talk to us about that?
Yeah, certainly. I think there are three interesting aspects to the semiconductor example. The first one, as you touched on, is geopolitics. So you've got a sector that's become really critical for the world economy, not just to the electronics industry, but to autos as well. We saw that after COVID with the impact the semiconductor shortage in 21, 22 had on auto production. So it's really critical, and it's based to a large extent in Taiwan, in a country that is obviously at a geopolitical fault line, if you like. So there's a really clear risk there that if political and military tensions were to start ratcheting up, you'd get severe impacts. And that's what's driven some of this, what you could call chip nationalism, which I'll come back to. I think the second interesting aspect is, again, it's an area where a lot of the action is behind the border. Both the US and Europe are spending billions, tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to persuade manufacturers to set up domestic semiconductor fabs. In the US, it's been the CHIPS Act that's driven that. Europe, we're seeing the German federal government spending very heavily to try and get investment, particularly into Saxony. There's some money at the EU level as well. And the last aspect with chips, I think, that's worth getting into and it's interesting is, I said at the start, protectionism isn't just about hitting imports. It can be about controlling exports. And in this case, it's of exports to China. The US has been using its sanctions regime to put a great deal of pressure on Western companies. So, for example, the Dutch company ASML, not to supply Chinese firms with the kind of sophisticated capital goods which are required to build up their capacity in advanced chip production. Fundamentally, it comes back to geopolitics again, is the US wants to impede China's ability to design and to build the kind of chips that are crucial in AI, in military purposes. And also in the opposite direction, China has recently put restrictions on the export of germanium and gallium, two very critical materials, very important semiconductors, also has military uses. So again, chips is an area where it's not just about tariffs, it's about other policy tools. And we've seen that's another aspect of protectionism or deglobalization. We've seen a big increase in the number of materials which are subject to export controls or export taxes. Sometimes that's about geopolitics or national security. Sometimes it's motivated more by desire to move upstream. So you have raw materials producers like Indonesia, big producer of nickel, big miner of nickel. They've put export restrictions to try and onshore the refining to move up the value chain, with some element of success there.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global experts network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insights call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
But the point is, there's no, economically speaking, this is all just sand in the gears. This is picking winners.
Absolutely,
these are distortions. Absolutely. It's kind of hugely concerning. I've been thinking for quite some time that the US has always sort of had this rival, and it was Japan in the 80s. It's just that we're throwing in this frisance of actual sort of hot wars and Taiwan and so forth into the latest rival, which is China. And just so much economic damage can happen. And you put it in the context of which we're going to come on to, a commodity business. Suddenly, and I think it was best put by Jeremy Weir of Trafigura a couple of years ago, it used to be where and how much, and now it's where and how much, but also where is it coming from? What's the particular trade policy there? What's our the proliferation of challenges to what has been the engine of economic development globally, bringing people out of poverty around the world, has been free. I'll get off my hobby box. But anyway, so but staying on that, before we talk about the commodities sector in specifics, the impact of this trend, and it's one that it's accelerating, as you highlighted, and it's one that's relatively new. It is the last sort of 5-6 years it's really been, growing exponentially. What are the broad impacts of this?
So, Paul, I think the broad impact is a slowdown in world trade, which we're already seeing. World trade it's not been falling, it's still been growing, but it's barely been keeping pace with global growth, as against last few decades where it's tended to grow faster than global GDP, as I said. And investment or economic nationalism doesn't automatically mean an end or a fall in trade. It can mean a regionalization of trade within blocks, in this case, to some extent, geopolitical blocks. Now, that's a trend that's really been accelerated, turbocharged by the Russia-Ukraine war and the Western sanctions response to that. So, in Europe, we've seen Russian pipeline gas replaced largely with US LNG. We're also seeing imports from China to US decline quite significantly. We're seeing transatlantic trade become a lot more important for both the US and Europe. And overall, our analysis shows we've seen the proportion of global trade, which is between countries you define as geopolitically close to each other, that proportion has risen since the pandemic. Now, as you were saying, what's the key point here? Even if total trade doesn't fall, but maybe just slows down, that fragmentation and all that sand in the gears means higher costs, and that's going to make the global consumer worse off. It's going to reduce real incomes, and it's going to push them away from goods towards services. It's going to change relative prices. I think also weaker cross-border investment flows and the impact of the uncertainty that trade wars create on investment, which we really saw in 2018-19. That's very bad for global demand as well. It's a demand side impact. And some simulation work we've done, some macro modeling we've done, suggests that a multilateral trade war could reduce global GDP by about 2.5%, industrial production by 4%. And obviously all of that would mean less demand for commodities. And there's an interesting and counterintuitive point here, actually, that you see in the simulation work, is that in the medium term, a trade war can actually be deflationary. Now, in the very short term, of course, it's inflationary. Putting up tariffs in the country that does it obviously raises costs and raises inflation. But the impact on the trade partners is deflationary because you're destroying demand. And then you've got that uncertainty effect and the effect on investment. It also destroys demand. So the global effect actually can very easily be deflationary for CPI, but particularly for commodities. And that's actually historically, if you think to the US-China trade war, recently pre-COVID, that wasn't a time of high inflation in the world economy. If you think about the 30s, big rise of protectionism, again, not a time of high inflation.
Yeah, and we're hoping to have an eminent historian and economist on shortly to talk about the historical analogies to this. And every time we've had this rise in protectionism, we've typically been followed by a war, which is kind of worrying. There's a couple of points that strike me. One would be, obviously, and I think to re-emphasize this point that you've already made, is this all slows down the energy transition. It also slows down the quality of the energy transition as well, right? In the 70s, Britain was producing some of the worst cars in the world because it had a protected domestic industry, right? And yes, the reason why those Japanese cars were bought in America was they were vastly superior, I would argue, to most models that GM and Ford were spitting out. So there's sort of this consumer, prices go up, but also quality typically goes down. And I know we're not allowed to, we as Brits, we've got my American hat too, but as we're not allowed to talk about Brexit. But just working through what you said there, you end up with more sort of this block trading. That kind of Brexit bet back in 2016 was essentially that the world would, they would benefit from sort of Singapore on Thames, that they would be unlocked from various trade, agreements and so forth, and, find partners around the world. And that bet, irrespective of whether it was good or bad at the time, has soured, I would argue, quite significantly in the global events of the last few years, right? Suddenly, being out of Europe and not having that strength of being in a bloc is a significant risk now in this more protectionist world. I guess what I'm saying is, it would seem to me the Brexit bet was based on an ever more free trade world, and we've gone the other way.
I think that's absolutely right. It was the worst possible time to start doing Brexit as a project. It would have been one thing to try and do it in 2002, 2003, when the United States was quite pro free trade, but to try and do it in starting in 2016 was very, very bad timing. Yes, I'd quite agree.
And that's probably about as much as we can talk about it without, breaking the unspoken rule. Right. Okay. So what does this then mean for the commodities sector? Because if you're on a board, you're an executive level, whatever it might be, a service provider, this has profound ramifications if these trends continue and indeed accelerate.
Yeah. So first of all, you got that demand destruction effect, which I mentioned, but you've also got potentially a lot of fragmentation of commodity trade. So to give an example, the Inflation Reduction Act has some very complicated what are called FEOC, so Foreign Entity of Concern rules, that determine eligibility for the subsidies in the IRA, including for EVs and batteries. So what those are there to do is partly to push out the companies of unfriendly countries from the supply chain, which is receiving the subsidies. What that means in practice is auto OEMs and battery manufacturers are going to want, if they want to comply with these rules and get the subsidies, which are quite significant, they'll need to source materials from particular places and be able to point to the absence of particularly Chinese firms in their supply chain. So potentially you're creating two-tier markets here. Now, CBAM, which is a European piece of policy, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that's ostensibly a piece of green policy, but it is also really a piece of trade policy that basically imposes some taxes relative to carbon intensity of a number of products. Again, that creates a similar potential for a two-tier market, and as could consumer preference. It's not just about governments here. If consumers have a preference for green final products that have a lower carbon footprint, and if firms want to kind of capture that demand and respond to that, then that's going to create two-tier markets. So thinking of like an auto OEM here who wants to be able to say to its customers, well, our aluminium has the lowest possible carbon footprint. What does that mean for producers and traders in commodities? Well, I think on the one hand, it's bad news because they're going to have to spend a lot of time and attention understanding these rules and lots of different rules and how they're changing. And they're also going to need to collect a lot more data on their supply chain, where their inputs are from, what their carbon footprint is, what the footprint of their suppliers is. Green policies are pushing that direction, but protectionism is just going to add to that. The positive side is I think that organizations, whether they're traders or consultants who can help end users and producers navigate those rules and get the materials they need from the right places, are going to have a big role and a lot of opportunity. I think the last thing I come back to on commodities is how it interacts, is how this economic nationalism interacts with the energy transition. Now, the energy transition for sure is one of the really important, perhaps the really important mega trend for commodities. Obviously for energy, but also for metals and even some fertilizers. So, phosphates in going to LFP batteries, for example. Now, my feeling is what we're going to see is increasingly we will see green objectives used as a justification for policies which are also having a protectionist effect. So, for example, the US has used sort of human rights as a justification for something called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which has very significant implications for solar, trade in solar PV and some other things. So it's a bit like almost using ESG as a reason for doing protectionism. I think you could potentially see this happening in Europe. So the EU might decide, actually, is it really so green to import that $10,000 Chinese EV or the batteries to make an EV when they're being made in factories which are plugged into a grid which is still coal dominated? So the EU could amend CBAM to do that, so they could move CBAM downstream, so it covers downstream goods. And I think that the other thing we're going to see is green policies that try and target wider objectives, which are more from the sort of economic nationalism playbook. That could be in terms of reindustrialization, like we talked about, like the Inflation Reduction Act, protecting or trying to boost domestic industries through import substitution. It could also be about things like energy security. So you have to ask yourself, why is China rolling out renewables at such an impressively breakneck speed? Well, yes, they do genuinely care about climate change, I think, because it's going to have a big impact on them. But also, renewables are giving them energy security. China is a net importer of oil and gas at the moment. The US is a net exporter. That's not a situation the Chinese leadership, I would think, are very comfortable with. And renewables are offering them a way out of that. So it's a win-win. So I think what we're going to see is increasingly economic nationalist policies and green policies overlapping and cross-fertilizing. And that's whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's a complicated landscape.
The other thing that sort of strikes me listening to you as well is these are sort of habit-forming behaviors by polities, right? And you're going to see, and we have seen it with the IRA, this doesn't, lots of companies are, at least in Europe and the US, or Europe and the Americas, or Europe and North America, but the rise of these policies can't just be directed at one country. So they are, they affect all countries. And, we could just see a period where even sort of that established trade between Europe and the Americas starts to break down on the basis of this. And it's really challenging for anyone to plan investment, which you've alluded to. And, you think about the biofuels world where, right now there's debate going on in Congress about whether they should ban used cooking oil from the rest of the world and so forth. And it really does add a level of complexity to decision makings around investment. It adds a level of risk and complexity around just normal trade. And this is in an environment, which I guess we've spoken about this on the podcast a few times, that many of the global trading houses or merchants they didn't grow up in inverted commas, and don't necessarily have the capability to be able to be spread around the world and understanding this entirely new lens that can shift very quickly and have profound impacts on your business and how you operate.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. What I would say is this has most impact on smaller and less diversified players, smaller companies, and it's always this case with regulation, right? The big companies often complain a lot about regulation, but it's really small companies who face the biggest costs, because big trading houses, big diversified miners, they can afford to have the teams, central teams, whose job it is to understand these things and to understand these complex rules and to some extent to try and forecast what's going to happen. So certainly it affects them, but you imagine what it's like for a small producer who's been quite happily doing a particular trade for perhaps decades and making a decent return on doing that. And suddenly you start having rules and tariffs which which completely changed the calculus.
Which again is inflationary, right? And we've seen incredible consolidation in the commodities sector precisely because of the barriers to entry going up, particularly around finance, platform and compliance. And now you're adding this complexity in. So we haven't seen this sort of cycle, the rise of a whole new sweep of trading houses or participants. And ultimately that concentration is inflationary in and of itself, right? So, well, it doesn't paint a very good picture for inflation in the long term, as we ride this cycle out, whether it's 30 or 40 years, or God forbid, things start to, escalate to a whole different level of horror.
No, absolutely. It's definitely a negative. It means things costing more and people having ultimately less real income, the money in their pocket going less far.
But an important insight, and I guess one you've been doing lots of work on. We'll put links in the show notes to you and some of your posts as well. And, hopefully we can have you back on in a year or so, Alex, and get an update on this, because I think it's a great opportunity to sort of step back and look at it in the broad view, because it is having profound effects, sort of, death by 1,000 cuts sort of thing. And it's good to be able to look at the whole picture.
Absolutely. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you today, Paul.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.